In this video, we embark on a journey into the twisted minds of history's most notorious serial killers. From their haunting crimes to the shocking details that surround them, get ready to explore and unravel the chilling story behind these notorious individuals. Welcome to our channel. Please hit the subscribe button if you are yet to, so that you do not miss out on any of our videos. Without further ado, and in no particular order, let's count down the top 15 serial killers in history. Number 15, Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez, known as the Monster of the Andes, is a Colombian serial killer who operated in South America from 1969 to 1980. He was born on October 8, 1948, in Santa Isabel, Colombia. Lopez targeted young girls primarily in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Estimates of his victim count vary widely, with some reports suggesting he may have murdered as many as 350 individuals, mostly girls between the ages of 8 and 12. Lopez's mode of operation was to approach vulnerable young girls, often those living on the streets, and after gaining their trust, he would lure them to secluded locations. Once alone with his victims, he would sexually assault and murder them, often using his hands or makeshift weapons. In 1980, he was arrested in Ecuador after attempting to abduct another young girl. Investigation by authorities linked him to multiple murders, leading to his confession. In 1981, Pedro Lopez was convicted of multiple counts of murder in Ecuador and sentenced to a maximum of 16 years in prison. Due to a change in the country's legal system, he was released in 1998 after serving only 14 years. He is currently a wanted fugitive in connection with a murder committed in 2002, and his current whereabouts remain unknown. Number 14, Albert Fish. Albert Fish, also known as the Gray Man and the Werewolf of Wisteria, was a notorious American serial killer. He was born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., and his reign of terror unfolded between 1921 to 1934. Fish's victims were primarily children, and he usually lured them away from their families under the guise of offering them employment or assistance. Once he was alone with his victims, he would subject them to unspeakable acts of torture and sexually abuse them. He also ate the bodies of some of his victims, claiming that consuming their flesh granted him a sense of power and control over them, even in death. Fish's reign of terror eventually came to an end in 1934, when he was arrested for the abduction and murder of 10-year-old Grace Budd. In 1935, Albert Fish was found guilty of the kidnapping and murder of Grace Budd, and he was sentenced to death. While Albert Fish was officially prosecuted for one specific murder, authorities linked him to at least 5 child murders during his lifetime. But Fish himself claimed his victims were over 100, and that he had one victim in each American state. He was executed on January 16, 1936, in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. Number 13, Yang Xinhai. Yang Xinhai, also known as the Monster Killer, was a Chinese serial killer who operated in Hunan Province, China, between 1999 and 2003. He was born on July 29, 1968, in Hunan Province, China. Over the span of 4 years, Yang Xinhai murdered an estimated 67 to 76 people, including men, women, and children. His modus operandi involved breaking into homes at night and using various weapons, such as hammers, axes, and shovels, to bludgeon and stab his victims to death. He also committed numerous acts of rape and robbery, in addition to his killings. During his reign, Yang Xinhai targeted isolated homes in rural areas where security measures were less stringent. In 2003, his terror came to an end when he was apprehended by the police during a routine inspection. He was found with stolen items in his possession, which led to his arrest. During his trial, he confessed to the murders, and in February 2004, Yang Xinhai was sentenced to death and executed shortly afterward. Number 12, Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was an American serial killer born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Wuornos's crimes unfolded between 1989 and 1990. She targeted and murdered 7 men, whom she claimed had either raped or attempted to rape her while she worked as a sex worker. Wuornos was known for her method of luring her victims to isolated locations before shooting them. In 1992, Aileen Wuornos was apprehended and subsequently stood trial for her crimes. Wuornos maintained her innocence in some of the cases, claiming that she had acted in self-defense. Despite her claims of self-defense, she was convicted and sentenced to death. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Number 11. Pedro Rodriguez Filho. Pedro Rodriguez Filho, also known as Padrinho Matador or Killer Petey, is a Brazilian serial killer. He was born on June 17, 1954, in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, Brazil. Filho's first murder occurred when he was just 14 years old. It was an act of revenge against the vice-mayor of his town, whom he believed was responsible for his father's dismissal and subsequent death. Over the years, Filho's killing spree escalated, targeting mainly criminals, drug dealers, and other individuals he believed to be deserving of punishment. He claimed to have murdered over 70 people, including rival gang members and even family members, and his acts of violence were often brutal, involving the use of various weapons. Filho believed that he was acting as a vigilante and avenging the deaths of his father and other victims. He saw himself as a good killer, only targeting those he deemed guilty. In 2003, Pedro Rodriguez Filho was arrested and convicted for his crimes. Due to Brazilian law, which restricts the maximum prison sentence to 30 years, he was released in 2007 after serving a fraction of his sentence. Upon his release, he expressed remorse for his actions and claimed to have changed his ways. Sadly, he was assassinated on March 10, 2023 by two unknown gunmen on a bike. Number 10. The Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer is an unidentified serial killer who operated in Northern California during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The name Zodiac was adopted by the killer himself in a series of taunting letters sent to the media and law enforcement agencies. The Zodiac Killer is known to have murdered at least 5 individuals, although he claimed responsibility for more than 30 killings. His targets were often young couples who were attacked in secluded areas. He would approach the couple's vehicles, shoot them at close range, and then flee the scene. One of the most chilling aspects of the Zodiac Killer's crimes was his correspondence with the media and authorities. He sent a series of cryptic letters containing codes, ciphers, and taunting messages, leading to widespread public attention and fascination with the case. Some of these codes remain unsolved to this day. Despite an extensive investigation and numerous suspects, the true identity of the Zodiac Killer has never been conclusively determined. It is one of the numerous unsolved mysteries in the history of American crime. Number 9. Serhiy Tkach. Serhiy Tkach is a Ukrainian serial killer and former police investigator. He was born on June 28, 1952, in Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine, and his killing spree took place between 1984 and 2005. During this period, he targeted young girls and women, predominantly between the ages of 8 and 18. His modus operandi typically involved luring victims into secluded areas where he would attack and kill them. One chilling aspect of Tkach's crimes was his ability to evade suspicion for many years due to his position as a police investigator. He used his knowledge of police procedures and investigation techniques to cover his tracks and mislead law enforcement. Tkach's crimes came to light in 2005 when evidence linking him to the murders was discovered during a reinvestigation of cold cases. He was arrested and subsequently confessed to the killings of at least 36 young girls and women. However, he is believed to be responsible for a larger number of murders. In 2008, Tkach was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for his crimes. During his trial, he expressed remorse for his actions, but his motive for the killings remains unclear. Number 8. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, was an American serial killer who operated during the 1970s. He was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. John Wayne Gacy did perform as a clown at various events and parties, and he used his clown alter ego to gain the trust of his victims and lure them into his grasp. This earned him the chilling nickname Killer Clown in the media. Gacy targeted young boys and young men, predominantly between the ages of 14 and 21. He lured his victims to his home under the guise of offering them employment, money, or sometimes by impersonating a police officer. Once inside his house, Gacy would overpower and sexually assault them before ultimately strangling them to death. After his victims were murdered, Gacy would often bury their bodies beneath his house or discard them in a nearby river. The exact number of Gacy's victims is uncertain, but he was convicted of killing 33 individuals between 1972 and 1978. Gacy's crimes came to light in 1978 when a young man named Robert Pius disappeared, and investigators began to focus their attention on Gacy. During the subsequent investigation, police uncovered the horrifying truth behind Gacy's actions, including the discovery of multiple bodies buried beneath his house. In 1980, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sexual assault. He was sentenced to death and spent years appealing his conviction. But all appeals were ultimately denied, and he was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Number 7. Thierry Paulin. Thierry Paulin was indeed a notorious serial killer from France. He was born on November 28, 1963, in Fort-de-France, Martinique, a French overseas territory. Thierry Paulin operated in Paris during the 1980s. He primarily targeted elderly women, gaining access to their homes by posing as a social worker or healthcare provider. Once inside, he would rob and murder his victims, often using extreme violence. His crimes went undetected for a significant period, as the victims were often elderly and lived alone, making it easier for Paulin to avoid suspicion. But in 1987, one of his intended victims managed to escape, providing crucial information that led to his arrest. In 1989, Thierry Paulin was apprehended, and he confessed to the murders of 21 elderly women. During his trial, he displayed a lack of remorse and exhibited a cold, calculating demeanor. Paulin was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison on April 16, 1989, at the age of 26, due to complications related to AIDS. Number 6. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, often referred to as the Milwaukee Cannibal or Milwaukee Monster, was an American serial killer and sex offender. He was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Dahmer's crimes, which unfolded between 1978 and 1991, involved the rape, murder, dismemberment of 17 young men and boys. Dahmer's modus operandi typically involved luring his victims to his apartment under the pretense of offering them money, alcohol, or companionship. Once there, he would drug them, sexually assault them, and ultimately kill them. For years, Dahmer managed to evade capture, until 1991 when one of his intended victims managed to escape and alerted the police. The subsequent investigation led to the gruesome discoveries in Dahmer's apartment, including photographs and evidence of his horrific crimes. In 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to 16 life terms in prison. However, his life behind bars was cut short when he was murdered by a fellow inmate in 1994. Number 5. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was an American serial killer who gained notoriety during the 1970s. He was born as Theodore Bundy on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. Bundy targeted and murdered young women across several states in America. He would often approach his victims under the pretense of needing help or faking an injury, exploiting their trust, before abducting and assaulting them. Bundy's modus operandi involved sexual assault, torture, and eventually, murder. He appeared charming, intelligent, and charismatic, allowing him to deceive his victims and evade suspicion. Bundy's reign of terror came to an end in 1978 when he was finally apprehended in Florida. He was ultimately convicted for the murders of at least 30 young women, although the true number of his victims may never be known. During his incarceration, Bundy became infamous for his multiple escapes from custody, which further added to his notoriety. He was eventually recaptured and faced several trials. Bundy was sentenced to death and was executed in the electric chair on January 24, 1989, at Florida State Prison. Number 4 is Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper is one of the most infamous and mysterious serial killers in history. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains unknown, so we don't even know if it was a man or woman. The Ripper was active in the Whitechapel district of London in the late 1800s, specifically in 1888. Jack the Ripper is believed to be responsible for the brutal murders of at least 5 women, known as the Canonical Five. The victims were prostitutes who were viciously attacked, mutilated, and killed. The Ripper's crimes were characterized by the extreme violence inflicted upon the victims, including throat slashing and abdominal mutilation. The case gained significant media attention at the time, and the name Jack the Ripper was derived from a letter allegedly sent by the killer to the police. However, the authenticity of the letter is still debated by experts. Despite extensive investigations and numerous theories, the true identity of Jack the Ripper has never been conclusively proven. Various suspects have been proposed over the years, including local individuals, doctors, and even members of the royal family. But no definitive evidence has emerged to definitively identify the killer. Number 3. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Butcher of Rostov or the Red Ripper, was a notorious Soviet serial killer. He was born on October 16, 1936, in the then Ukrainian SSR, Soviet Union. Chikatilo's killing spree spanned from 1978 to 1990, during which he targeted and murdered at least 53 people, predominantly women and children. His victims were often lured to secluded locations under the pretense of offering them assistance or promising them employment. Chikatilo would then sexually assault, mutilate, and murder them, and in some cases eat their bodies. Chikatilo's acts of violence were driven by sexual impulses and a deeply disturbed psychological state. In 1990, due to increased police scrutiny and forensic advancements, he was finally apprehended. Chikatilo was convicted of his crimes in 1992 and sentenced to death. Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the head on February 14, 1994. Number 2. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, is an American serial killer who operated in Washington state. He was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. Ridgway's killing spree began in the early 1980s and lasted for over 20 years. He targeted primarily young women, many of whom were involved in prostitution or had a history of drug abuse. Ridgway's modus operandi involved luring his victims into secluded areas, usually near the Green River, where he would strangle them to death. His nickname, the Green River Killer, came from the discovery of several victims' bodies in the Green River, which runs through Washington state. The exact number of Ridgway's victims is unknown, but he confessed to murdering 49 women. It is widely believed that the actual number may be much higher. Ridgway's crimes remained unsolved for many years until advances in forensic technology and DNA testing allowed authorities to connect him to the murders. In 2001, Ridgway was arrested and subsequently pleaded guilty to numerous counts of murder. As part of a plea agreement, he provided information about his victims and their locations, aiding in their recovery and identification. Ridgway was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Number 1. Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death, was a British doctor and one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. He was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England. Shipman's crimes spanned over many years, from the 1970s to the late 1990s. As a trusted medical professional, he took advantage of his position as a general practitioner to commit his heinous acts. Shipman targeted his patients, predominantly elderly women, by administering lethal doses of drugs, primarily morphine, under the guise of medical treatment. His victims' deaths were initially attributed to natural causes, and Shipman managed to evade suspicion for a long time. However, as the number of deaths under his care grew significantly higher than average, concerns began to arise among colleagues and family members of the deceased. Shipman's actions eventually came under scrutiny, leading to a thorough investigation. In 2000, Shipman was convicted of 15 counts of murder, but further investigations revealed a much larger number of victims. In total, it is estimated that Shipman may have been responsible for over 200 deaths. His motives for the killings remain unclear, although suggestions range from a desire for power and control to financial gain through falsifying wills. Harold Shipman was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Shipman died by suicide in his prison cell on January 13, 2004, and he never revealed the full extent of his crimes or provided a clear explanation for his actions. And there you have it, the top 15 serial killers in history. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating content. See you in the next video.